I can't be the only one. I can't be the only one that takes a look at the NBA as a whole and the playoffs in particular and say, this is boring as shit. The most boring I've ever seen in the NBA? No. Boring as shit, nonetheless? Abso-freaking-lutely. I know I'm not the only one that feels this way. And why is that? Why do people like me look at the NBA playoffs and say, this shit is really boring now? Why do we look at the NBA and say, this crap sucks? You know, what is it? And I want to talk a little bit about that because I think it helps kind of flush out what I perceive to be some of the problems with the NBA today. Now, some of you might look at it and say some of the problems with the NBA might be in the playoffs might be that of its political leanings of its players and that a lot of people resent that. And here's what I would say to that. Is there are plenty of people in the NFL that were expressing similar viewpoints and it doesn't seem to be killing the NFL. You could think that maybe some people stopped watching the NBA because of the players' political leanings and beliefs and what they espouse. And that may be the case, but I'm sorry. I'm totally sorry on this one, not sorry. I find that incredibly hard to fucking believe. Especially if you've been somebody that's loved your team for 20, 30, 40, 50 damn years. You're really going to stop watching because one player or a set of players says something that bothers you a little fucking bit? A, that's the epitome of snowflake behavior. B, I just can't see that happening. And I think, like, speaking to that is just a really closed, narrow-minded view that is totally missing the point. Now, some of you might point out and say, well, Jeff, being a Bulls fan, you have a lack of rooting interest, so if your team's not in the playoffs, you don't really care. And there's certainly something to that. But I don't think it's lack of rooting interest alone. Because how many years I watched the NFL playoffs and the Bears aren't in it, and I'm still really interested. I could watch the NHL playoffs and be incredibly interested, even as a much more casual viewer, and not have a rooting interest, not have the Blackhawks in there. So you could say, yes, naturally, having a rooting interest will automatically increase your emotional investment in what's going on and emotional investment in the playoffs as a whole. But no, it's not a lack of rooting interest. And some of you certainly are going to be like, oh, here goes this boomer bitching about how great the past was and how everything sucks now. And he's just stuck in the past. Get over it, boomer. The times have changed. You know, yes, I grew up watching the NBA in the 80s and the 90s. And I do feel that it was a vastly superior product in the league with vastly superior stars at the time. That said, just because stuff is in the past doesn't mean it was always great. That post-Jordan to, when you talk about like 99 to maybe 2005, 2006, the NBA was horseshit. It was really, really bad. Who wants to sit there and watch a bunch of NBA Finals games or playoff games and with final scores of like 78 to 73 or 76 to 67? Who the hell wants to watch that? Who wants to go back to those times? I certainly don't. When you want to talk to me about the purely most boring era in NBA history, I think it's that one. But at least then, you know, especially when you talk about at the beginning of the 2000s, you had the Shaq and Kobe Lakers. So there was at least something interesting, something compelling, and at least in the Western Conference Finals, whether it would be the Trailblazers or it was the Sacramento Kings, whatever, you at least had something you could point to and say, there's some type of rivalry here, there's something interesting, you know, even if the NBA Finals would largely suck. So it's not being stuck in the past. The product just sucks now. But what is it? Like, what really makes the NBA product so bad and so hard to follow and so pointless at times to watch? I think number one is the lack of parity. How many teams can you really look at each season and say that this team legitimately has a shot to win the NBA championship? Maybe 3, maybe 4. At least with other sports, especially when you talk about the North American Big Four, you can look at baseball and say, you know, who knows what could happen from one year to the next, and teams can make a run out of nowhere and surprise everybody and win it all. It doesn't always happen, but it can. When you talk about the NFL, we certainly know about the parity there. Like a team could go from worst to first from one year to the next. Teams could win 5 or 6 games one year and win the Super Bowl the next. So the point being is, for the vast majority of fan bases, you have a belief that if everything goes right, your team could potentially make a run. Certainly there are always exceptions to the rule, but in general, you know that the field is very wide open to start off the year. NHL, you could sit there and say there's certainly parity there too, but when it comes to the NBA, it's maybe 3 to 4 teams, and some years it's even that. Like a few years ago, it was, the Cavs and Warriors are going to face off in the finals, and let's see if the Cavs can beat the Warriors this time. Like, at some point in time, it gets a little meh. And you just get to the point where you're like, okay, can we just get to maybe the conference finals, or in some cases even just the NBA finals? Like, you feel like the regular season largely doesn't matter, and you don't have those elements to make you care about what happens during the regular season. And then when you get to the playoffs, usually the first round is a fucking snooze fest, like this year certainly has been. My God, all the washouts and blowouts and mismatches. Like, who the fuck thinks this is interesting or entertaining? For every Denver versus Portland game, you get 6 other damn blowouts. And you're just waiting, you're saying, hey, can we get to the place where you get down to the Final Four or even the championship series? Because there's just a lack of parity. Why the hell would you care about a lot of this stuff? I think lack of player loyalty is also a problem. Not from the player's standpoint. And I certainly am glad that they've got leverage and they can exercise that leverage and they can utilize it to their advantage. But there is no doubt that it kills fan loyalty to teams, to players, to the product. Because let's say you're a Cleveland fan and you had LeBron James those first several years. And then he goes to Miami. Well, what the fuck do you do now? Then he comes back to Cleveland. And then he goes to the Lakers. And I mean, what the fuck do you do now? You got players changing teams. You got all this turnover and tumult every year or two when it comes to so many of these teams. Like, it's really hard to get emotionally invested in the players. Like, yes, you could get emotionally invested in the teams. Like, I got emotionally invested in the Bulls of the 90s. But I got emotionally invested in the Bulls of the 90s because you had MJ and Scotty and Phil, and they were the constants. They were the stars. They didn't go anywhere, except what Michael Jordan had to save the universe with the basketball-playing aliens called the Monstars, which was documented in the true story called Space Jam. And fuck LaFlop James for trying to make his own bastardized, dumbass version of it. But I do think that lack of player loyalty really hurts, because not only do these players change out so much, but you don't typically have that story of teams working their way up. They make the playoffs one year, then they win a series the next year, and then maybe they make it to the conference finals the next year, and maybe then they make it to the NBA finals, and perhaps they win it, but perhaps they come up short and they have to come back again. Like, there's something about the journey, there's something about the story. Well, and a lot of times in the NBA today, there's no journey, there's no story. It's just, bam, you put together a super team and they go to the fucking finals. I look at it too and I say, a lack of balance in the game. No, I don't want to go back to the days of games being won and lost in the 70s. No. But would I like to see it not be such a bombs away 3-point game where you're passing up so many open layups and mid-range jump shots? Yeah, I would. That's basically what you're doing, is you're watching the NBA now, and for the most part, you're just watching a 3-point line. You're just watching a 3-point contest. So it leads to these wild varying swings where you'll get moments where you see some incredible offensive skill, and you see these moments where you see all types of scoring. And then you see Brick City, baby, and I compare it similarly to Major League Baseball. It fell in love too much with the sabermetrics and analytics bullshit, which valued getting on base and hitting the 3-run home run over situational baseball. So when it goes right, it can be really good. It can be crisp to watch. But when it's not, it can be ugly as shit. You lack the flow and continuity on offense. You're just waiting for everybody to run to the 3-point line and jack up a bunch of bullshit. You have too many stretches of that. So yeah, teams end up scoring more points because they're taking more threes. But when you think about the flow and the style of the game, it's just not very compelling or interesting if you have any standards, in my humble opinion. Miss the days of where you had some dominant big men and you had some post game. Like, most of these guys in the league now couldn't post up to save their fucking lives. And then I come to the lack of defense thing. Like, what you'll see some of the younger fans and some of the dopier fans in media that have a narrative to sell now about the modern NBA is that it's not a lack of defense. These players are just so vastly superiorly skilled offensively that the defense doesn't matter. Give me a fucking break. The defense is bad. Really, really bad. Consistently. And not just the lack of defense. It's the lack of physicality, especially when you talk about back in the day, there used to be this thing called playoff fouls. You know, no fucking layup rules, those types of things. Now, if you breathe on somebody, they sit there and go, oh my God, I was murdered. And then we have to go to the review to see whether it's a flagrant 1 or a flagrant 2. The league got pussified. Yes, I understand after the Malice in the Palace, you had to do something. But they took all the sizzle and physicality out of the fucking game. If you trash talk somebody, that's a fucking technical. If you dare get a little physical with them, that's a fucking flagrant. That's a technical. Like, who the fuck wants to watch that? Like, at least you could say with the NFL, where they've changed the game and the style of play has changed, there's still enough of the elements that made football. There are still enough of those elements to provide balance, such as some running game, such as some defense, to keep it fucking interesting. In basketball, you don't have that balance anymore, and you certainly as fucking hell don't consistently have that defense anymore. And even if you have teams that play what is actually great defense, you know, then it can be boring to watch them damn selves. But no, even when you look at the teams that play great defense now, they really don't play great defense in terms of an all-time scale. They just play great defense relative to the crappy level of competition that they have now. But yeah, there's no passion there, it feels like, anymore. It's just so watered down and so sissified. But I think the single biggest problem with the NBA today is just the lack of rivalries. The lack of team rivalries, the lack of player rivalries. Like back in the 80s, you had the Celtics and the freaking Sixers, and then you had the Celtics and the Hawks, and you had the Celtics and the Pistons. You had the Celtics versus the Lakers. When you look later on, you had Bulls and Pistons, and then during the 90s, you would have series like Bulls and Knicks, and later on, Bulls versus Heat, Bulls and Jazz. Like, there were legitimate rivalries there. Magic versus Michael, Bird versus Magic, Bird versus Michael, Michael versus Isaiah, Michael versus Drexler. Like, I could go on and on and on. But those rivalries mattered. Like, even when you look back on the early 2000s Lakers, like, what we remember most is not just Shaq and Kobe winning the 3 straight championships, but it's them playing the Kings in the playoffs for a couple of years. Like, that was a rivalry that meant something. We don't get any of that shit now. We don't. We don't have the rivalries that are especially critically important during the regular season. You're sitting there saying, okay, it's the Lakers and the Clippers. They both play in LA. That's not a good enough basis to call it a real rivalry, especially when it's so goddamn dominated by one side of it in the case of the Lakers. And then what are you going to say? It's LeBron and AD versus Kawhi and Paul George. Why the fuck would they hate each other? Why in the hell would they have any problem with each other? Kawhi has beaten LeBron before for an NBA championship. Paul George maybe is not, but who gives a shit? Like, you think about that type of stuff, and you say, okay, or if it's LeBron taking on, like last year in the bubble, talking about the Miami Heat, like, where the fuck's the juice or the sizzle for that? There isn't any. It's that lack of rivalries. It's that lack of things that can really get fans emotionally invested in the regular season and the playoffs that I think is missing as much as anything else. That's due to the change in the approach to the game. That's due to the lack of player loyalty and all of that. But even when you look at it, just the style of play itself, like, even if you have these rivalries, they don't mean the same because you don't know when you're watching it just how much it actually means to these guys. You got too many of these whiny pussy bitches sitting there flopping around at every stupid thing, bitching at the refs and everything. I used to think MJ was bad towards the end of his career with whining to the refs. LeBron and this crew now take it to a whole different fucking level. So you could call me old and you could call me a boomer all the hell you want. Even though I'm not nearly the age of a boomer. But it's the lack of parity, the lack of player loyalty, the lack of balance in the game, the lack of defense, and most importantly, the lack of rivalries that make the NBA playoffs, the NBA as a whole, boring as shit.